A city that vanished into the sea in under 2 minutes. A people erased so completely that we still argue about what they even called themselves. And a war that the most powerful empire on earth lost, then quietly scrubbed out of its own history books. All of it happened on one island, Jamaica. You know it for the beaches, the reggae, the rum, the smiling faces on the tourism ads. But underneath that postcard sits a history so buried, so deliberately wiped from the record, that most Jamaicans were never taught even half of it. Not in school, not in the guidebooks, not anywhere the average person would ever think to look. This is the story of what that island is actually sitting on. And by the end, you might walk away seeing Jamaica as one of the most important and most erased places in all of human history. Before we go any further, if you find the real version of history more interesting than the polished one they hand you in a classroom, do one thing for me. Subscribe. This channel exists to dig up the stories that got buried on purpose. That is the whole mission. Now let us get into it. Start with the name itself, Jamaica. Almost everyone assumes it is Spanish or English, something a colonizer stamped onto a map. It is neither. The word comes from Xaymaca, and it belonged to the Taino, the people who lived on that island for hundreds of years before a single European ship ever appeared on the horizon. Xaymaca meant land of wood and water. That is not a throwaway detail. It means the name of the entire country is a fossil. It is one of the last surviving words of a civilization that was almost completely wiped from the face of the earth. The Taino had villages, farming, trade, a spiritual system built around carved spirit objects called Xaymacs, and art painted deep into caves that you can still find today if you know where to look. Then, in 1494, Christopher Columbus landed on his second voyage, and within a couple of generations, the Taino of Jamaica were effectively gone. They were not relocated, and they were not quietly absorbed into some new colony. They were destroyed. Diseases they had no defense against, forced labor, and outright violence collapsed a population that may have numbered in the tens of thousands down to almost nothing. By the time the Spanish were finished, the people who named the island had been erased so thoroughly that historians still argue over the basics of how they actually lived. And here is something genuinely strange. The Taino did not vanish from your life either, even if you have never set foot in the Caribbean. Words like hurricane, barbecue, canoe, and hammock all trace straight back to the language of these people. You have been speaking fragments of an erased civilization your entire life without ever realizing it. Their staple foods, like cassava, sank so deeply into the island that they outlived the people themselves. Think about what that really means. An entire people, the original owners of the land, reduced to a handful of borrowed words and a few paintings on a cave wall. And that erasure happened so early that it barely registers in the popular story of Jamaica at all. But the Taino were only the first thing that island swallowed. Fast forward to the 1600s. The Spanish get pushed out, the English take over, and on a thin spit of sand at the mouth of Kingston Harbor, a town explodes into life. Its name was Port Royal. For a few short decades, Port Royal was arguably the richest and most lawless place in the entire New World. It was a pirate capital. Privateers like Henry Morgan used it as a base to raid Spanish ships and Spanish cities, then hauled their plunder back here to spend it. Gold, silver, and stolen cargo all flowing through one tiny town on the edge of the sea. They called it the wickedest city on earth. Taverns, brothels, and gambling dens packed street after street. Money moved through Port Royal at a speed most of the world had never witnessed. It was Las Vegas 300 years before Las Vegas existed, a boomtown built on piracy and the raw wealth of empire. And then, on the morning of June 7th, 1692, it ended. A massive earthquake struck the island. The loose sand that Port Royal was built on started behaving like liquid, a process we now call liquefaction, and in roughly 2 minutes, most of the city slid straight down into the sea. Streets, buildings, ships, and thousands of people were swallowed whole. Some estimates put the immediate death toll at around 2,000, with thousands more dying afterward from injury and disease. An entire city, the beating financial heart of the Caribbean, gone in about the time it takes to read this paragraph out loud. To the strict religious authorities of the day, that destruction looked like far more than geology. They called it the judgment of God on a city of sin, and that story stuck for generations. What makes it darker is that Henry Morgan, the most famous pirate ever to operate out of Port Royal, had already been made lieutenant governor of Jamaica, and he died wealthy and respectable years before the sea finally took his old stomping ground. The line between criminal and colonial official was always thinner than the empire liked to admit. Here's the part that makes it one of the most erased places on the planet. Port Royal did not just get destroyed, it got preserved. The city sank so fast that it settled onto the seabed almost intact, frozen at the exact moment of the disaster. Divers and archaeologists have since pulled everything from a pocket watch stopped near the time of the quake to intact bottles and whole buildings out of that seabed. A snapshot of one specific morning in 1692. Today it still sits underwater, off the coast of Jamaica, one of the only sunken cities of its kind anywhere in the world, a 17th century time capsule most people have never even heard of. You could honestly argue that Jamaica is sitting on top of an underwater Pompeii, and barely anyone on Earth knows it is there. But the deepest erasure of all is not a lost people or a sunken city. It is a war. When the English seized Jamaica from the Spanish in 1655, something happened in the chaos that would change the island forever. Enslaved Africans who had been held by the Spanish escaped into the mountains. They did not wait around to be freed by anyone. They freed themselves, and they vanished into some of the most brutal terrain in the entire Caribbean. That terrain has a name: the Cockpit Country. It is a maze of limestone hills and sinkholes so disorienting that one stretch of it is literally called the Land of Look Behind, because you had to keep glancing over your shoulder just to survive in there. For an outsider, it was a nightmare. For the people who learned it by heart, it was a fortress. These self-freed people became known as the Maroons, and they did something the history books really do not like to sit with. They built free, independent communities inside a slave colony, and when the most powerful empire in the world marched in to destroy them, they won. For years, the British sent soldiers into those mountains to wipe the Maroons out. It failed, over and over again. The Maroons fought with guerrilla tactics, camouflage, and ambushes, and they built a communication network around the abang, a cow horn they used to send signals ringing across the hills. Redcoats trained for neat European battlefields were being picked apart by fighters who knew every rock and every ridge. On the western side of the island, the Leeward Maroons were led by a man named Cudjoe, sometimes written as Cudjoe, a short and relentless strategist who turned the mountains into a war machine the British simply could not crack. On the eastern side stood the Windward Maroons, and their most legendary figure was a woman. Her name was Nanny, Queen Nanny of the Maroons. She became such a towering symbol of resistance that today she is the only woman honored as a national hero of Jamaica. Her face is printed on the money, and yet outside the island, most people have never once heard her name. To this day, legends swirl around Nanny, painting her as both a spiritual leader and a battlefield genius the British could never truly corner, no matter how many soldiers they sent marching up into the hills she ruled. She earned every inch of it. By 1739, the British finally gave up trying to win. Instead, they did something almost unheard of for an empire at the very height of the slave trade. They signed a treaty with Cudjoe. They formally recognized the Maroons as free, granted them land, and effectively admitted out loud that they could not defeat them. A community of escaped slaves had negotiated peace terms with the British Empire as something close to equals. And remember exactly when this happened. At the same moment, Britain was building its entire fortune on human bondage. A group of self-liberated Africans in the Jamaican mountains dragged that same empire to the table and forced it to sign. That is not a footnote. That should be one of the most famous stories of resistance in the history of the world, and almost nobody outside the Caribbean has ever heard it. The peace did not last forever. In 1795, tensions boiled over into the Second Maroon War, this time centered on the Maroons of Trelawney Town. The British brought in overwhelming force, including tracker dogs shipped in specifically to hunt human beings. And eventually, the Maroons surrendered under promises that were quickly broken. Roughly 600 of them were loaded onto ships and deported all the way to Nova Scotia, into the freezing cold of Canada. Years after that, many were moved yet again, this time across the Atlantic to Sierra Leone in West Africa. Sit with that journey for a moment. People stolen from Africa, born into slavery in Jamaica, who fought their way to freedom, only to be shipped to Canada and then sent back to the very continent their ancestors were taken from. An entire community bounced across the planet by an empire that could not stand the simple fact that they existed free. The Maroons were far from the end of it. The real story of Jamaica is a story of people refusing to accept the roles they were forced into, again and again and again. In 1760, an enslaved man remembered as Tacky led one of the largest uprisings the Caribbean had ever seen. Tacky and his followers, many of them Akan people from West Africa, rose up across the island in a coordinated revolt that shook the entire colony to its foundations. For a brief window, they seized weapons, took control of plantations, and came dangerously close to sparking an island-wide war for freedom. It was crushed with horrifying brutality, but it rattled the colonial authorities so badly that its aftershocks rippled outward for decades. Then came Christmas of 1831. A man named Samuel Sharpe, an educated and deeply religious enslaved Baptist deacon, organized what began as a peaceful strike. Tens of thousands of enslaved people simply refused to work unless they were paid and treated as human beings. It escalated into the largest slave rebellion in Jamaican history, often called the Baptist War. It was put down without mercy. Sam Sharpe was executed for it. But before he died, he's remembered for saying that he would rather die than live one more day in slavery. And here is the twist the empire never bothered to advertise. That rebellion, and the savage way the British crushed it, caused such an outcry back in Britain that it helped push the empire toward abolishing slavery just a couple of years later. The very people the system was trying to erase ended up helping to end that system itself. Sam Sharpe is a national hero now too. His face is on the money as well. But ask almost anyone outside the Caribbean who ended slavery in the British Empire, and they will name a British politician, never the deacon in Jamaica who lit the fuse. That is what erasure actually looks like. It is not always a fire that burns the records to ash. Sometimes it is just quietly deciding whose name gets remembered and whose gets left out. So how do you erase a people, a city, and a war, and still somehow miss something? Because the deepest history on that island was never written down at all. It is alive. When Africans were brought to Jamaica in chains, the entire machinery of slavery was built to strip them of everything: their names, their languages, their religions, their families. And yet, it never fully worked. Fragments survived, hidden in plain sight. Listen to Jamaican patois, the everyday language of the island. It sounds like broken English to outsiders, but it is not broken anything. It is a full language, with its own grammar, built by fusing English words with West African structure. A phrase as simple as "mi de ya," meaning I am here, carries patterns you can trace straight back across the ocean. Every sentence a Jamaican speaks is a living record of that collision, a history no colonizer ever managed to delete. Look at the spiritual traditions. Practices like kumina, meal, and revival carried African ways of understanding the world across the ocean and kept them breathing for centuries. The British were so threatened by all of this that they passed laws criminalizing obeah, trying to make African spirituality itself illegal. They wrote it into their own law books as a crime. And still, somehow, it survived. And out of all of that survival came something that eventually reached the entire planet: the Rastafari movement, born in Jamaica in the 20th century, and the music it helped inspire. It was shaped by the words of Marcus Garvey, a Jamaican born in the town of St. Anne's Bay, who became one of the most influential Pan-African thinkers the world has ever produced. Garvey told black people scattered across the globe to look toward Africa, to reclaim a history and a dignity that colonialism had spent centuries trying to bury. When Rastafari Makonnen was crowned Emperor of Ethiopia in 1930, many in Jamaica saw the fulfillment of that message, and a new faith grew out of it. Reggae did not come from nowhere. It grew straight out of this long history of resistance, of people gripping onto their identity inside a system engineered to erase it. When the world hears that sound, it is hearing the echo of everything we just talked about, even when it has no idea. So step back and look at the whole picture at once. An island whose original people were wiped out so early that we can barely reconstruct their lives. A financial capital of the New World lying almost intact on the seabed like a frozen crime scene. A community of escaped slaves who fought a global empire and forced it to sign a treaty. Rebellions that helped bring down slavery itself, led by people the world was never taught to name. And a culture that survived one of the most systematic erasures in human history by hiding itself inside language, faith, and music. Jamaica is not a tiny place with a light little history. It is a tiny place carrying some of the heaviest, most deliberately buried history anywhere on Earth. And the reason you were never taught most of this is not because it does not matter. It is the exact opposite. It is because for a very long time, powerful people had very good reasons to keep it quiet. The beaches are real. The music is real. But they sit right on top of a story about the limits of power and the refusal of ordinary people to simply disappear. That is the real Jamaica, not the postcard, the thing buried directly underneath it. If this changed the way you look at one small island on a map, imagine what is buried under all the places you think you already understand. That is exactly what we do here. We dig. There is another video waiting on your screen right now about a piece of history they would much rather you forget. Go watch it, and I will see you in the next one.